University of Manchester. She's also the clinical lead for Manchester Experimental Cancer Medicine Centre and is director for the MRes in Experimental Medicine at the University of Manchester. She previously trained in medical oncology in Cambridge, where she completed a PhD funded by a CRUK Clinical Travelling Fellowship. In 2012, she was awarded the Rothwell Jackson Postgraduate Travelling Fellowship and travelled to Canada to undertake a 2-year drug development research fellowship based at the University of Toronto and the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre. In her current position, she is co-investigator on a portfolio of over 50 early phase clinical trials and is a principal investigator on over 20 trials. She's a research interest in clinical trial design, preclinical model development, colorectal cancer, and carcinoma of unknown primary. So thank you very much for speaking today. Just to say to everyone, as before, if you have any questions, please just type them into the chat, or you can direct them to one of us specifically to pose to Natalie at the end. So take it away now, Dr. Cook.
Thank you. So can I just double check you can see my slides?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you for inviting me to talk today, and thank you for the introduction. When I was originally invited to talk at the Notch meeting, I actually hadn't heard of Notch before, probably because I trained in the South and then went out to Canada. And I thought you were inviting me to talk about my PhD because I did a PhD on the Notch pathway. So, this is obviously much more relevant to you all. I'm sure you don't want to hear about my PhD research. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about clinical trials. The outline I was given is essentially everything you would need to know about managing trials patients day to day. Now, including things like consent, mandatory reviews, navigating protocols, and trials reporting. Now, to me, that sounds a lot like GCP training. And obviously, the last thing I want to do on a Sunday morning when you've given up your free time is to rehash some GCP training. So my hope is that we are going to cover a little bit about what that GCP training is, but nowhere near the detail that we would normally do. I'm hopefully going to go through some useful hints and tips with regard to these processes. And I'm going to finish the talk at the end by talking a little bit about this new role that's come out from the NIHR called the Associate PI role. Some of you may have heard of this already, and apologies if you have. But I think it's really useful to think about this and actually then take this back to your consultants at sites. So,
hello, hello, you. It look alike.
I think someone's not on mute.
You look like a baby. You look like a really big boy. Yeah.
Oh, on mute now. Sorry. I managed to get rid of my kids out the house, so that's always a helpful thing first thing on a Sunday morning. So, and I know there's a real diverse audience. So again, apologies if some of you know some of this. Apologies if I'm going too quickly, but obviously you can have a copy of the slides and obviously email me if you've got any other questions. I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of an overview. And again, I know Ruth just talked a little bit about research and how we integrate it, but I think it's really important now more than ever that we manage to deliver clinical research within the NHS. And I think this is something that was brought to the attention under the last Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies. And obviously Chris Whitty's been very busy to think about this. However, with the rise of COVID, and sorry, this is just a document that I think is really useful to read, looking at integrating academia and NHS work. So in the times of COVID, I think it's really important to think about how we deliver clinical research. And actually, our hand's been forced a little bit with how we do things. And obviously, during the lockdown, the coronavirus did shut down a lot of trials for multiple diseases, including cancer. And I think this made us all realise that, you know, are there ways of doing things differently so we can keep our patients safe on trials? And I think what now, obviously, certainly I'm in Manchester, which is COVID central at the moment, but I think we need to look at how we can still run our research, still keep our research staff in positions that we're doing cancer research, because it's just as important to do that as it is to do COVID research. And I think, you know, that's the negative is that everything got shut down, but hopefully everything is continuing almost as normal now with regard to clinical trial activity. I think there's been a number of actually really interesting papers that have come out reviewing how we need to rethink clinical trials related to cancer research because of what COVID made us think about. And apologies, I've only got a couple of slides on COVID, then I'm not going to talk about it again. But there's been quite a few of these papers, and if you haven't seen these or read them, I think they actually are quite useful. I think we need to look at improved trial design. We can look at how we can incorporate new technologies such as wearables. We need to eliminate all the unnecessary extras that I guess we've just basically gone along with. And I think there's a lot of things in trials that we could actually remove. We need to have quicker approvals process, which I think is happening. And again, I think with how the vaccines are being developed and the trials are with COVID, I think they're realizing that actually they can move a lot quicker than they realized. I think we need to be more patient-centric, which I think is something that's changing. I just pointed out this trial here, which is this review paper here that was written by Gary Doherty and colleagues and published in Nature Cancer. This is quite a nice one because it looked at how we traditionally approached managing patients on trials and then actually adapted to that with regard to kind of COVID measures. And I think it just kind of discusses what we can do and how we can do things at home, in the community, incorporate wearables, phone assessments, video assessments. So there's so much more we can do now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things that have already been incorporated into some trials. So on to managing patients on trials. To me, once you've got the trial open and you're managing the patients, you've actually done all the hard work. And I know Becky Lee's going to talk a little bit later about, I guess, how you get research projects started. And some of that will be initiating the actual trial. So you've already defined the question, you've already assessed the feasibility, you've already written the protocol, or if it's a commercial trial, you've reviewed the protocol to see that your site can take this on. You've developed collaborations, you've obtained the funding, which in this day and age is much harder than ever before. If it's commercial, again, that actually might help you because the funding can come into your department that could also help them fund other things. You've gone through the ethics process, the registration, all the research governance, and also local implementation. So you've got the capacity and capability to take on this trial. So actually, if you've gone through all that already, and we're talking about managing patients on trials, that is ultimately the hardest work. I think the managing side of things is actually fairly straightforward. And again, you may have already heard of this, but the NIHR Clinical Trials Toolkit is actually a really useful tool for people to use if you don't understand what to do at each step, or if you're starting your own trials. And I think, if you, on the actual website, if you go over each of these circles, it'll actually then open up another page where it will tell you a bit more detail about each of these sections. So again, I would advise, if you've not seen this before, to have a play around with it, because I think it's actually really useful, particularly if you want to start your own trials. And actually then going on to managing patients on trials, it's actually there's increasing complexity within this, and there's a variety of reasons behind that. We know more now than ever about molecular biology of cancer, which is really important. There's been a rapid advances with technology. There's been a huge immuno-oncology success, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and that actually just in itself has changed the way we run trials. We've got now more precision medicine trials. We've got pan-tumor approvals coming through now, and how we actually incorporate that into clinic when everyone's so disease focused, usually, unless you work in the phase 1 world. And you've got these matched therapies being approved. You've got potential accelerated regulatory approvals. So we need to do things as efficiently as possible, even if, we need to do them as fast as possible as well. And we still need to focus on making trials widely available. So the worry is that if you're increasing the complexity of these trials, both, all the way through to phase 3, that they're only going to be running the big centres. And that, and again, I work in a big centre. I can see we have a huge trial portfolio, but we need to make sure that's still available to patients in other hospitals that may not be able to come to the central hospitals, or, and we need to be able to see if we can work out ways of working with other hospitals so that patients still have access to the trials that they need. And this is just a diagram, and again, apologies if we've covered any of this, but we're basically increasing the number of patients going on to trials. The number of sites are increasing massively throughout the whole globe. Previously, it's been basically North America and Europe. Now we've got Japan, Korea, and China who are doing things extremely efficiently. And I guess we are to a certain degree in competition, because we need to make sure we still get both commercial and academic trials up and running in the UK. Quite often we didn't select patients for trials, apart from, say, you have a breast cancer trial, or in the early phase trials you should just have all comers. But now more than ever, it's not even just you're selecting by histology, even subtypes of histology within certain disease types. You're selecting by mutational profiles, by prior exposure. So again, we're getting more and more selective about who can go on these trials, and rightly so, because we need to find the right category of patients that are going to respond to these expensive drugs. I think the way we gather knowledge now is changing as well. I think we're involving much more CROs within our trials, and managing databases and feeding back to the sponsors or the pharmaceutical industry, rather than investigators being there. So I still feel we have a very, very important part to play in that, because because obviously the CROs sometimes are good, but quite oftentimes they have quite a high turnover of staff. So we still need that direct exposure to the pharmaceutical industry. And for those of you that may not know what a contract or clinical research organisations are, there's been a big boom in the kind of last 10 years, I guess, of the pharmaceutical companies basically paying these CROs to run the trials for them. So, you'll have heard of all these words like IQVIA, PowerXL, PPD, Syneos, Theradex. They all run the trials, and actually they've got this is a huge business now, and I think we have to work more and more with these CROs who are kind of acting as the in-between with regard to pharmaceuticals. And I think again they have a wealth of expertise as well, so it isn't a bad thing, but actually we still need that direct access to the pharmaceutical industry to be able to develop our own trials. And the reason this has happened is because there's been a number of accelerated approvals of new drugs, particularly immunotherapy drugs, over the last few years. 3.5 years for drug development from basically phase 1 to approval is amazing. And the reason that's happened is because we've seen some amazing responses on trials, which is fantastic because we're picking the right patients for these trials now. And actually the number of drugs being developed has increased exponentially over the last kind of 10 years, and that's only going to increase further, not just in cancer but across all different diseases. So you can see why things are changing, but we still need to be able to do this and manage patients on trials as safely as possible. So going on to the things that you asked me to talk about is like consent and mandatory reviews on trials, and I guess how we do that, what the issues are, and how we can do things, I guess, better going forward. Little bit of GCP here, just because I think it's important to us always to remember this, is obviously all of our clinical trials are strictly controlled by UK regulations, and you can only conduct a trial if you basically abide by the conditions and principles of good clinical practice. And you have to have up-to-date GCP training, which is essentially every 2 to 3 years, depending on your institute. You must abide by the protocol, the clinical trials authorization if you've gone through MHRA approval, and also ethical approval. And you can only take part in any of these activities if you are suitably qualified and trained to undertake it. And it's important to realize that, because I think sometimes we may get junior trainees that come along and may not be as familiar with kind of what GCP is, or equally what the trials are. And I think, if you're not happy to do some of this and you're not GCP trained, then you shouldn't be doing it. And I actually think GCP training, obviously everyone does it in refreshers. It's actually really useful when you do it, because I think a lot of it sometimes you do not forget, but you're just not using all the practices all the time. So, and again, every trial has a delegation log, and you must only sign up to those tasks that you are potentially delegated to do or you're confident to do. And often one of these is informed consent. So again, if you're not confident about what the trial is you're consenting patients to, and the knowledge behind that trial, then you shouldn't be signing patients' consent forms to do that. You may also, with regard to consenting patients, you may also be asked by investigators to select the right patients for the trial. So you may be the person going out and they say, well, can you find me a patient that's suitable? And so it's how do you do that, and how do you make sure you are selecting the right patients? But not just selecting the right patients, but trying to have the diversity of patients, which I'll touch on a bit later. How do you make the patient information sheet understandable to patients? And I think, again, that's increasingly difficult with the complexity of trials, when you've got maybe 8 drugs in a trial and you don't know what arm the patient's going to get randomized to, and trying to explain all that is actually really difficult. There's remote consent now more than ever, and I'll talk about that. It's becoming harder to involve relatives and carers. I mean, certainly at the Christie at the moment, only patients are allowed in the hospital. We're not allowed any relatives or carers in the hospital. We're starting now video consultations, and patients can phone their relatives to be there, but it's still not the same. And I think we need to try and involve them more if we can. And also, again, mixing all of this research, which we're all passionate about, with ever increasing service demands, and trying to do all of this while you're actually covering the wards, covering other service clinics. It's really hard, and I haven't got a brilliant solution for that, but I'll just talk a little bit later about how potentially you can do that. And the reason why selecting patients is hard is because you've got more biomarker driven trials, and that's rightly so, because if we've got a good biomarker for a drug, then you should be using it. We need to find the right, I talk about genotype quite a lot, because obviously we've got a lot of molecular profiling around now, but to find the right molecular profile for a patient, you've got to do this on all of your patients, particularly as there's a very low frequency for a lot of these rare driver mutations. And, we don't, a lot of centres do not have access to that at the time of looking at trials. And I think that's a really difficult one. And my hope is that with Genomics England changing, hopefully increasing access, that will change. But at the moment, it's still very difficult, and we're trying to find solutions of this in the early phase world, just because most of the trials coming through to us now have some kind of target or molecular profile that we were just expected to do. And I think, again, we're very lucky where I am, is that we have access to that. But actually, we need to not just find solutions for where big centres, we need to find solutions for the whole country. And biopsies, fresh biopsy requirements are often requested, and that puts more pressure on the service departments such as radiology. And again, now more than ever, where there's such a backlog of issues, is trying to then manage that and how actually this can help radiology, because actually, say commercial trials can bring in radiology money, which will help them, but equally you've still got to put that on top of really busy service departments. And then also validating those biomarkers in trial and the high standards that it must come to. I mentioned earlier just a little bit about diversity. I think we are still putting very select patient groups into clinical trials due to very strict inclusion/exclusion criteria. And I think there's been a number of consensus statements out recently about loosening inclusion/exclusion criteria. The diversity is over a number of different areas. It can be race, age, gender, socioeconomic status, comorbidities. And really this is important because we need to understand how representative the population that you put in this trial is of the real world. Because if you're getting drugs approved on the trial basis, how is that really relevant in the real world population? Is it only a small percentage of the real world that we're seeing in these trials? So I think it is really important we start to look at that. And again, some trials are already written, you're managing them, but I think if you can feed back whether if there's an inclusion or exclusion criteria that just feels that wrong to you, or feels that it's excluding patients that you think could be relevant, then I think you should feed that back to the sponsor, or PI, so they can feed back to the again, we talk about age, and I did a recent study looking at early phase trials, looking at the older populations, and we didn't see any outcome for patients being referred for early phase trials, any difference in outcome or toxicity. However, I still feel that the patients that we are seeing as a select population that's been referred through, and I think it's important to, again, I think people are doing more and more work now to try and increase diversity, but it is an issue, and I think everyone needs to realise and try and question trials when we're looking at that. Going on to understandable PISs, I think we're involving patients more at inception of PISs now, so that they can actually feed back, and I always get patient involvement when I write a patient information sheet. Make sure you read it yourself. Make sure if you've got friends or family that if you're writing your own PIS, that they're not medics, that they actually understand it, because they'll give you honest feedback. And I think importantly, you need to understand the patient's level of knowledge. So, when I was in Cambridge, I treated a number of professors who kind of felt that they probably knew more than I did at that time when I was a junior trainee on the trial. In other areas, you may be dealing with patients that have maybe left school at 15 without any exams, and really do not have the level of knowledge that, in a way, sometimes they really don't even want to read the PIS. So it's about trying to explain that to the patient in a way that they understand what they're putting themselves forward for, even if they're not going to be able to thoroughly understand the PIS. And I think we need to work with ethics committees as well to try and make PISs less complicated, potentially even take videos instead of PISs. I think there's lots of ways we can look at this, and I think we need to kind of, in a way, challenge the system a little bit, because it's not unusual for me to have PISs now for my trials that are 30, 40 pages long, and I can guarantee you that the vast majority of patients do not read that thoroughly. They need adequate time to consent, and mostly this is over 24 hours at least. For some trials where you just require, say, pre-screening, you can do that on the same day, but obviously the patient still has to be able to understand what they're, again, signing up for, and you need to discuss that with them thoroughly. And you need to document all this as well, and make sure you've got the right version of the PIS, and document the discussion, and make sure that's thoroughly documented with regard to the side effects, risks, and potential benefits of the trial. I talked about remote consent, and I think, to be honest, where I work, that we're a little bit behind the times on remote consent. I know that Ruth, and I know that people like Jeff Evans in Glasgow are very good, and they've already got very good systems in place for remote consent. And again, patients don't want to travel as much anymore, and if we can reduce the number of visits to hospital, that's great. I think there are commercial tools now available. There's also HRA and MHRA guidance on remote consent, so I think it's something that we should be doing increasingly more if we feel confident to do that, and we already know the patient's willing and fit enough for going on a trial. We need to share what accepted processes we have across the UK, what information to provide, how consent must be recorded, how we do electronic signatures. Again, this is something we do all the time now, and there's no reason why that can't be used. And actually the MHRA and HRA guidance also state that. And importantly, if you're in a commercial trial or even an academic trial with a CTU, you need to discuss with sponsor if you want to change the process with regard to remote. And they'll give you very clear feedback about what they feel is acceptable, and you'll have to follow that. But I think there's no reason, if we've got patients coming from long distances, why remote consent can't be looked at. And again, this isn't suitable for everyone. I realise that there are some patients that would not be happy doing this, but I think it's just looking at the different ways we can do things to make it easier both for investigators and patients and get more patients on clinical trials. So the perfect trials clinic to me, when you're managing these patients, is basically a team approach. I think we talked about service and research, and I think hopefully most research patients are seen in research specific clinics, not always, particularly in busy district general hospitals when you've only got one clinic a week, so in that certain area. So I think it's important to try and separate those research patients if you can, and if not, then try and see them in a block at the start of clinic, because they sometimes take a lot longer and you have to go through all documentation very thoroughly. As a trainee, obviously, if you've got any questions and you're not happy to do anything, you have to involve the PI or the CI of the trial, and they should be happy to be involved because it's their trial and ultimately their responsibility what happens at site. There's some amazing clinical research nurses and practitioners out there that again have a huge knowledge and often assess lots of adverse events on trials. And ask other clinical fellows, SPRs that may be around that may have already had a lot more experience, because again, they'll be happy to help, I'm sure. My team particularly have a large team of research admin staff who are fantastic, a fantastic resource if I've got any questions. But ultimately, you just have to follow the protocol. I mean, the protocol's there, you need to have access to it. You have to follow what it says, and if you do that, then ultimately you can't make any mistakes. And I often do clinic, and sometimes a fellow will come to me or SPR and say, tell me something. I'm like, well, have you looked at the protocol? And ultimately you've got to look at the protocol if you've got any questions, and if it's not covered in that, then you go to someone else. We talked a little bit about remote consent, but then looking at mandatory reviews on trials, again, I think there are things that we can do remotely nowadays, and we've got a team at the Christie called the Digital ECMT team who are again trying to push this forward, not just in Manchester but actually across the country. And we're developing tools and apps so that we can actually bring in patient-reported opinions around clinical tolerability. We're actually looking at real-time clinical decisions with regard to data. We've got in-home sampling now, so we've got this sampling kit where they can measure creatinine to make sure that the creatinine doesn't change on trials that may have an effect on creatinine. There's treatment trackers that the patients can give feedback in real time. And again, there's a lot of information out there and a couple of good publications that have come out about patients reporting their outcomes. So I think we just need to, again, there's so much more we can do now in the digital age that we need to be looking to incorporate these into trials more than ever. And I think we're just at the start of that now. And I think to a certain degree, COVID's forced us to start looking at this even more. So then going through to kind of navigating protocols and reporting in trials. So the study protocols are getting more and more intricate. There's significant amounts of comprehensive data collection as part of trials, loads of correlative components that you have to do now, multiple amendments over time, and obviously every time you do something you have to make sure that you are up to date with the amendments. And all of this requires increased manpower and increased resources that often the NHS doesn't have. And again, I think this all needs to be looked at. And I think if you're in a hospital that does a lot of research, they'll realise how important this is for the hospital. Every protocol essentially has a similar format, and there's GCP guidance on this, where they all have this format. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but they're all the same on the outset, and it's just about knowing what sections to go to. Obviously you should have read the protocol if you're heavily involved with it, but actually in a busy clinic where you're seeing patients, you need to know where to go to find the information that you need. And importantly, sometimes, certainly our fellows do this, but where we want to assess whether we should take on a protocol, you need to look at how feasible that is, and how workable it is for the unit. Can you do all the tests on site or in the associated hospitals of the site? Will any special equipment or investigations be required that you don't do on site? Can you provide all the assessments on relevant days? So for example, some trials, particularly early phase trials, they might require 7 days of assessments. Do you have the capacity to do that? How intense are the visits? When are your clinics? How is it going to kind of be part of that? And actually the workload as well. Do you have adequate amounts of clinicians, nurses, data managers, trial coordinators to actually do this trial? So I think, you know, it'd be great for trainees to get more involved with the feasibility of a protocol, because I think these are important tasks that we take on as PIs. And actually, if you can have a look at this and trying to be involved with the feasibility process as a trainee, I think it's a hugely useful task to undertake. How does the protocol fit within your kind of unit? Do you have the patient population, which is really important, particularly when we're looking for very rare genomic drivers now? You know, could you run this? Do you see these patients? Can you do the molecular testing? If not, do you have access to it elsewhere? Are there competing trials? And again, this is probably more relevant for bigger centres. I mean, we have 40 early phase trials open just in my phase 1 team. And, you know, we've got disease teams running their own trials, disease-specific trials. And, you know, we try and as much as we can try and coordinate with all these teams to make sure that we're not competing for the same patient population, because the last thing you want is to open up a trial and then not recruit patients to it because there's another trial open and the patients aren't getting referred through. So I think that needs to be looked at in the big centres, and there needs to be really close collaboration between all the different teams to make sure this works efficiently. And is it an unmet need for patients? Are there already treatments that are being approved in this situation or trial, or you know, is it an area that actually your patients would want to go on to? And I think that's a really important factor to fit into it. And then going on to kind of reviewing in clinic, these are the kind of main areas. If I'm in a clinic and I'll almost definitely look at a few protocols every clinic I do for my patients, because they're not all my protocols. I work in busy clinics and look at other PI's protocols as well. So the synopsis is always a very useful kind of first step to kind of refresh your brain as to what area you're looking at. If they're not on trial, before I even consent anyone to a trial, I'll go through all the inclusion, exclusion, just to make sure that they are actually eligible. You know, someone might have done those checks before, but if you're the one doing the consent, you need to be absolutely sure that that person is not going to be it's basically screen failed at the earliest opportunity. And if you can go through those checks beforehand, admittedly it takes more time, it can save time later. And if you can save the screen fail from your centre, your PI will be very happy. Trust me. The schedule of assessment is also very useful, particularly when you're trying to plan clinic visits with patients and when they come back, because they like to know schedules. And importantly, the adverse event and the SAE section, which I'll just talk a little bit about later. And obviously, there's always a dose limiting toxicity section if you're in the phase 1 component, but I won't touch on that. Dose modifications if patients aren't tolerating treatment, or if there are other things, toxicities going on, and importantly, cotton meds. And I think, you know, a lot of patients may want to start different drugs or like antibiotics or other treatments during the time period of the trial. You just got to make sure that it's allowed and double check the cotton med section in the trial protocol. I'm not going to touch on this too much just because it's basic GCP training, and I don't really want to go through that in any detail because I presume everyone knows GCP. But obviously adverse events, just as a reminder, is any untoward occurrence that can happen during the conduct of a study. Can it be attributed to the study? Is it serious? Is it consistent with available information about the study, so the IB or the SMPC? And all definitions of AE are in the trial protocols. So again, you have to look at the trial protocols for these. Don't guess, look at the trial protocols. As we report in trials, we use the CTCAE guidelines, which again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Make sure you're using the right version. The latest version is, I think it's 5.1, I can't even remember myself. Just make sure with regard to the protocol you're looking at the right version. Mainly, there's not that many changes between the versions, but there are some. And really importantly, use the right terminology when you're recording adverse events. And sometimes the research nurses do this, sometimes it's the trainees, sometimes it's the consultants. You know, some of the common issues are, you know, quite often if someone's got pneumonia, you can put pneumonia down, but actually that's not on the CTCAE log. Lung infection is down. You'd have to put that. Things like altered taste, which is a particular issue with one of my drugs at the moment. Dysgeusia is the official term, and actually that's what's in the CTCAE log. So again, if you can just use that right terminology, it's not going to bring up issues with regard to data later that you or the consultant will have to deal with. So just try and get the right terminology and what's defined in the CTCAE, use the right version, grade it, stop and start dates, and try and determine causality if you think it's possibly related to the drug or the actual drug in question or not. A series of adverse events. Any event which is the following: life-threatening, results in hospitalisation, causes important or long-lasting disability, congenital abnormality or malformation. And again, the definitions for SAEs are in each trial protocol. So if you're in doubt as something's an SAE or not, just look at the trial protocol. Even if you're thinking possibly isn't, possibly is, you need to report it still, and it can be changed at a later date. So as long as it's reported within 24 hours, that's the most important thing there. You often will see trials patients come into hospitals, and I think, again, it's an important thing to think about. Quite often when my patients come in, I think people, my on-call team, get a bit twitchy because they're on the drug, they're on a drug that's got basically numbers after it rather than a name, and they're like, what is this patient on? And you know, the important thing is you need to treat the patient. If the patient's unwell, you need to treat them as you think is appropriate. However, you should also take into consideration what trial they're on, and there should be access to certain information about the trial. So the research team may be available, certainly within hours. Out of hours, each hospital that's running trials should have access to kind of a summary of the trial for out of hours care and what you need to do and what known toxicities there are, and also what medications you can and can't give. You need to inform the research team that as soon as possible, if it's outside of hours, that they've come in. And if in doubt whether the trial medication is essentially causing the patient symptoms, you need, I mean, obviously this is for mainly oral treatments, but you'd need to interrupt treatment until you talk to the research team. And often we'll get calls out of hours if it's particularly complicated. And actually, if it's a patient who I've given a new drug to, I'll always be on the phone initially just to make sure there's no issues. And I think, you know, don't be scared. All the information's there. It's just knowing where to look in your units. Reporting in trials, and I think, again, it took me, I wasn't until I was a senior trainee when I realised actually who the sponsor of a trial was. But essentially it's usually the organisation that takes ultimate responsibility for the initiation, management and financing for the research. And so pretty much every trial we're involved with has to be sponsored. For a lot of the commercial studies, the sponsor is the pharmaceutical company. And for a lot of academic studies, the sponsor is either the university, the hospital, or the CTU that's running the study. So again, it's just important to know that when we talk about sponsors and sponsors making decisions, we have to report everything back to them. And so really your responsibilities is I think, is to consider clinical trials for patients as much as we are busy. I think patients, we know that, you know, if we can get patients on trials, it's better for the trust, it's better for the patients. And obviously, you know, it is good to get patients on trials as long as they're willing to do so. I think you need to make sure you complete your GCP training, attend refresher courses. Always keep an up-to-date signed and dated brief CV, because we'll always ask for that. And make sure you ensure complete documentation in patients' notes or electronic records for what's happened with that patient. Always be on a delegation log, read the protocol thoroughly and report SAEs as quickly as possible. So the final little section is about optimizing experience and how we do that. So ideally, and again, I know this isn't possible in all centres, you want, if you can get it as a trainee, a timetable session for research. Now, I was very lucky in Cambridge that I did have some time where I could do research, and that, you know, to me, actually, I did a PhD, but actually clinical research and clinical trials was where my heart life throughout the whole of time period. And I managed to do a lot of kind of clinical-based research as well with regard to protocol writing, PAS writing, going through ethics applications, which I think is hugely important. I think it's important that you have a mentor on site who understands clinical trials and actually the importance of clinical trials, rather than, I guess, sometimes it's more scientific, but actually the vast majority of work I do now is within the clinical side. And actually I do a lot of commercial trials, and you know, I find them hugely rewarding as well, because we're getting some really exciting drugs through in the commercial sector, which are really benefiting patients, and ultimately that's what I care about. I think as much as experience as you can get as a co-investigator, and again, you know, sometimes you might need to look for that, but there'll be plenty of trials open in your institutions where you could become a co-investigator and take more of a leading role. If you can get some time out to do clinical trials unit and trials expertise, that's brilliant. If it's not possible in your current training positions or fellowships, then maybe look elsewhere to do out-of-program fellowships. And I know Sam was probably going to discuss some of this later. This is the only thing I'm going to discuss about it. This could be the UK, it could be abroad, obviously at the moment, but abroad's much more difficult. But there's a number of fellowships that are offered in big centres in the UK if you want some really dedicated research time. Again, sometimes these aren't advertised, and it's about just approaching those centres. And I think that's fine. Certainly we're very used to that. And I think it's just about asking what's available. And then again, there might be masters, MRes programs or clinical trial-based MD programs if you don't want to go forward with a kind of more scientifically based PhD. This is all perfectly acceptable. And I think if you're interested in clinical trials and doing clinical trials widely as possible within the UK, and these are great alternatives to get a higher postgraduate degree. We run an MRes program in experimental medicine in Manchester, which is always very popular. And I know, for example, big centres like the Marsden also do clinical trial-based MDs for a lot of their kind of later phase trials, which is great. So again, there are opportunities there. You just have to look for them because sometimes they're not advertised as widely as you'd like. So to finish off, I just wanted to talk about the NIHR Associate Principal Investigator role. And this is something that's come to my attention only recently, but it's a scheme that's been started to try and engage junior doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals in the NIHR portfolio research. It was actually initially developed for surgeons, and actually it started in the Midlands actually, and the uptake was really good, and they've now rolled it out into other specialities, including oncology. And I think I think they'll be overwhelmed, to be honest with you, once oncology get their heads around this, because I don't think they realise how many studies we actually do in oncology. And really it's to develop the next generation of PIs, CIs, and there's a number of other initiatives, but I think this is quite a nice one. And it's to give you first-hand experience in trial tasks normally assigned to PIs, things like I was discussing, like assessing feasibility of trials, coordinating data, feeding back to sponsors, just to give you those types of experiences within your centres. And again, you can have access to these slides. This is the things you need to feed back to your PIs or CIs at site if you're not aware of this. It's open to trials within the NIHR portfolio. Ideally, this is going to be investigator-led trials at your unit, or trials for which your university or hospital is the CI centre, because you'll have ultimate control over that. The sponsor of the trial and the CI of the trial would have to approve the addition of this associate PI. And importantly, the local PI is still responsible for the local delivery study. So it's like you've not taken any responsibility off the local PI, and actually REC doesn't need to be informed as well. So there's no extra paperwork from a kind of trial point of view. It's just going through this NIHR scheme. And then from your perspective as a trainee, you need to prospectively register for the role. And actually, it's all very well explained on the NIHR website, which you can just go on to NIHR Associate PI, and it will come all up. There's a specific checklist that's been developed to highlight activities that would be carried out by the associate PI, and certainly for fellows that come and train in our unit, it's everything that they do anyway. I mean, it's quite intensive, and our fellowships, they do only deal with research and trials. And so if you're in a normal training program and maybe rotating around, it's a bit harder to get all those activities done, but I think you should be able to do that. And at the end of what rotational period, and normally they say a minimum of 6 months you have to do this role, then the applicant should meet with the local PI to review the checklist document to make sure they thoroughly understand all of it, they've gone through all of it, and then the PI can sign the checklist. And at the end of it, then you'll be given an NIHR endorsed certificate to indicate the study and the time and the period. So again, I think it's quite a nice thing to do. And again, hopefully, once you then become a consultant, it gives you more, evidence to say that you are ready to be a PI at your site for whatever studies you're running, whether they're commercial or academic. And importantly, actually, that you then have to be acknowledged in the primary publication. Now, it says acknowledged, whether that means like co-authorship or just an acknowledgement, I'm not sure. And I think, for some trials, it's easy to get on the papers, and others, large commercial trials, it's even difficult for the PIs at sites to get on it. So I think, again, that's just something that needs to be discussed with the local PIs or CIs. And as I mentioned, it's all on this, it's all on the website, and I think it's a really interesting scheme to look into more detail. And certainly we are doing this. We are looking to do this at the Christie. And I don't think there may be one oncology study at the moment, but hopefully now we've opened the floodgates, there'll be lots more interested parties. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for taking time out on your Sunday. I hope it wasn't too GCP focused and kept your attention. And if you are interested in learning more and doing more, obviously we do have an MRes as well. We're full for this current year, but we're open applications for next year in January. So feel free to contact me, email me if you want any more information. And I'm happy to take any questions in the 5 minutes I have left.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and lots of things to think about for those of us who are, interested in working in this area in the future. In terms of questions, please feel free to continue adding them to the chat. I've got one question from Mark Baxter. He asks, actually, Mark, do you want to just ask your question if you want to unmute?
Yeah, no problem. Natalie, thanks very much for an excellent talk. It's a very broad topic, so
yes.
really appreciate that. Notch is very much focused on collecting real-world data, and we know that our cancer population is very much aging, and traditional endpoints within clinical trials such as PFS, overall survival, and response rate might not be the best endpoints for an older population. And I just wondered about your thoughts about development of novel endpoints, for example, overall treatment utility that was used in the FOCUS-2 and the GO2 studies, and where they might be able to come into early phases as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is done much more so in the late phase trials and looking at kind of patient experiences using validated quality of life questionnaires. And I think it's extremely important to understand how, if we're developing drugs, how it actually impacts on patients' life. And I think it should be incorporated not just in late phase trials, but also in early phase trials. I guess talking about real world evidence and outcomes, and again, I think that everyone's waking up to the fact that there's so much data out there nowadays, just in general. And I think the NHS is a really powerful resource to be able to collect all that data in the right way. And I think you guys are already looking at that. And I think that's brilliant, because again, it's something that we need to do more and more of, particularly when we've got very small patient populations, or smaller patient populations being treated with certain drugs. I think if we can get the real world outcomes for patients that are going on to this once it's approved, then actually that's a really powerful resource. But we just need to be able to do it together and work together to do that. And I think you're already doing that. So yeah, I think we need to look at different endpoints. We need to bring it in an early phase trial setting. I don't think it's going to be taken forward quickly by pharma, but certainly for investigator-led studies, I think it's really important.
Thanks for that question and answer. I guess kind of leading on from that, I guess I was wondering that I think in thinking about where early phase trials fit in the scheme of medicine as a whole, I know that there's sometimes a lot of sort of debate, and I think there's been certainly on Twitter, there's lots of debate about phase 1 trials leading to approvals, and obviously you've highlighted some of the sort of positives of that. But I think some feel perhaps immunotherapy has created a precedent which isn't matched by other things that have also been approved. So I guess I just wondered what you thought about, kind of leading on from that question of other novel endpoints, or how we find the balance, I guess, for not taking too much from phase 1 trials and not forgetting what their function is and what their purpose is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I can give a whole separate talk on the change in phase of trials and what's happening, because I think what's happening is a lot of the trials that we're running aren't just phase 1 anymore. They then go into phase 2 dose expansions and then go straight to registration. So I think the way we run trials, it's not phase 1, 2, 3, it's completely changing. And I think because we've got a much stronger knowledge of the biology behind tumours, the driver mutations, we've got great drugs that pharmaceutical companies are developing. I think you can see what's going to work from a very early phase. And what you want to do is give the patients access to that as quickly as possible, but you still need to be able to get those safety readouts as well as efficacy readouts in the right population. But importantly, understand if it doesn't work the way you want it to work, to try and understand that and interrogate it further. So I do think that the endpoints that we use in trials are changing quite significantly, and that even the way we design the trials are changing as well. So, and again, if you go to any of the workshops, like I guess Jing and NIHR hold a number of workshops, you'll understand a bit more about the methodology around trials and how that's changing the way we run things.
That's great, thank you. We've just got time to squeeze one more in from Anna.
Thank you so much for a really great talk. I've got a question more about career, and so often when you're sort of at the beginning of your oncology career, you're thinking about what tumour group you might want to go into. And I just wondered, I know it's slightly off topic, but just sort of about whether being a trialist and only doing clinical trials is a career option, and how that might look, and how you kind of get there if it is.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think, you know, a lot of us are pressurised into doing PhDs, and I don't regret 1 minute for doing a PhD, because I think it's made me stronger in the phase 1 world with regard to knowledge of how we get there. But I think that there's some really great options now to do postgraduate degrees in clinical research and clinical trials. I think it depends on. I mean, I've always been interested in GI oncology, and now I'm running trials that you know, are urology based, are breast based, you know, not something I would have ever thought about doing, but I actually don't mind doing it, because it's, you know, I like the science behind it, and actually the drug development's very interesting to me as well. So I think you know, with regard to disease focus and just basically trying to do clinical trials, I think you can do that within an NHS clinic and have also a trials portfolio that runs alongside your kind of service practice. And I think it makes your job more interesting. It's just how you balance that when there's increasing pressures. And I think when it comes to seeing what job plans are being advertised, to make sure, if you can, that there's some research protected time in that, because then it will allow you to develop that commercial trial portfolio and get the established connections that you need. And I think you also need to make sure that your centre's behind you on that, because I think if your centre has a forward-thinking kind of medical lead that wants to do more research, then that's brilliant, because that means that they will probably bring some of that in, and hopefully that will be offered to new consultants coming in as well. Because to be honest with you, there are more trials than we can run at a place like the Christie, but there's lots of other centres that we can run them in. And so I think, again, it's just looking at that, and I think you can do it. I think it's hard just to do only kind of clinical trial research. I think it probably has to be mixed with a little bit of service commitment, but there's no reason why, if you're doing and bringing in trials to your team, why you know, if that it takes off and you're doing a brilliant job at it, why then you can't revisit your job plan and do more and more of it. I think it's just making sure that the area that you're doing it in is something that really interests you.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Cook. Much appreciated on a Sunday morning.
No worries.
I certainly got a lot.
No worries. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Likewise.